It's Wednesday. I think one of the aims of Pellin, and I think one of the aims of the Pellin tools is to make hard things easier. Okay, and in terms of what we're looking at, this material recently, I've been saying truth is a struggle and secrets are a burden. It's a sort of theme for taking the material to a slightly different place. And when we were looking recently at, Sunday, at the part of ourselves that we can't know directly, in other ways, how we're perceived by the world. And in our work, that draws on what David Pellin, in a somewhat obscure way, I feel, it's not an easy part of his work, called out self-identity, which, I think it's one of his awkward uses of words, and yet the power of the concept I guess has influenced me to hang on to how he talked about it, even though it has a certain sort of awkwardness in the label of it. But it has some particular powerful effects, and I feel he got at something stronger than I'd seen anywhere else. And that is a social worker, which I wasn't then, being able to say, well, I know how my clients see me, or I know how the trainees in the correctional institution see me. Or a lawyer being able to say, I know how my clients see me. Or a parent being able to say, I know how my kids see me. David's coming on and saying, no, you don't. And, not making a big deal about it, but just saying, no, you don't. You can't know. And the way he put it, and he was funny, he'd put numbers on things, He'd had to go, he'd say, if you get high, you're going to be 6 times longer in the low than you were in the high. And he just put numbers on things. And I wasn't always drawn to that. And anyway, he put numbers on this. You can't ever know all of your self-identity. If you're lucky, you might know sort of 50 or 60% of, but you can't know it all. And then he said, sort of, I, on the other hand, know probably 70 or 80% of mine, and everyone just burst out laughing. I think it was a moment I can't quite convey, but it was David sort of claiming a self-knowledge that people would say, no, you don't, Dave, you're the same as the rest of us. And everyone burst out laughing when he made that statement. And he was a bit shocked for a moment, and then he laughed. And I guess the reason I tell that story is, we can't know how we are in the world as much as we think we do. And within that, there's a lot of misunderstanding, hurt, tragedy. And at times in the work, I've called it the unknown self. And the examples I use, and I think I get halfway through explaining this and then lose my track. So I'll try and not lose my track today. I used to be able to say before this, when for most of us, there weren't many times when we saw our own image or heard our own voice. That's not true anymore because we've got Zoom. In teaching self-identity, I used to be able to say, if we all had just met at a meeting and there was a video of that meeting, we'd be familiar with everyone except one person. And the person who we see and hear, who we are unfamiliar with, is ourselves. Sort of Zoom has blown that rather nice example of mine out of the water, okay? Because we are familiar with our own voices and we're familiar with our image. But I still think, if there was a video of the four of us and we're all looking at the replay of that video, we would have a familiarity with the other three, and there would be a certain strangeness about ourselves. I don't talk that much. I don't interrupt people that much, whatever. And some of us, even when we have had this sort of new human experience of seeing our own image and hearing our own voices that once only film actors and actresses had, or newsreaders had, there'd still be a lack of familiarity with ourselves. And when things go wrong, and as because of David's, because the concept was always a bit awkward, I came up with my own slightly restatement of it, if I can use that word, which was the persona gap, the difference between our perception of ourselves and other people's perceptions of us. And within the persona gap, there is often, and I can't quite explain why, it's a bit of a mystery, but because of the persona gap, I didn't mean to say it that way. Within the persona gap, there can reside some of the most fundamental things we need to work on. And yet they come across in a fairly seemingly unimportant way. There are ways that we communicate in the world and connect with other people that are a turnoff or are not effective, that often point to fundamental work we need to do. I've seen that over and over again. And it came out not really in theory, it came out in practice in the long residential programs that SEAS knows about. When we give and receive a lot of feedback with each other, and they would really point to things we needed to work on if we're going to move ahead in our life. It wasn't programmed, but it just happened. I'm trying to think, because today's Wednesday, we need to be coming up with examples. I remember getting a piece of feedback from a man called Martin Foster, and he's passed away a few years ago. Martin was a tall man, over 6 foot, maybe 6 foot 2 or 3. Good looking. He was a sort of ski bum drug dealer in Chicago. And he, his brother had an ice cream van, and he would occasionally take his brother's ice cream van. They call good humor vans, am I right? Yeah.
Yes, good humor. Well, or the ice cream truck.
And you know, with that jingle of that particular piece of music. So Martin was doing this. You know, a tall, fairly tough, streetwise guy. And some kids ordered ice cream and then wouldn't pay him. No, that wasn't it. They wanted ice cream, but they weren't going to pay him. And they told him that. And he said no, pretty heavily, and buzz off. And one of the kids pulled out a gun and shot him through the neck. And he was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life, which was quite long, and was spent with his wife, who he met in Pellin. But anyway, before he met his wife, he refused to press. He wouldn't give evidence against the kid. No, the kid wasn't charged. But he was in a wheelchair. Somehow or other, he got a very generous insurance settlement, which would finance all sorts of medical help. And one of the resources that Martin found was the Pellin Institute in southern Italy. So Martin Foster arrived in Pellin in a wheelchair. And the building was on quite a long slope, okay? Anyway, and then we had a meeting to start the program, and Martin was, I can't remember her first name for a moment. The second name is Brown. And Mary was
Trish, Peter.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, Martin's sitting on one end of the room, big room. It was a big program, that one. There were about 15, 18 people. And Trish was sitting on the other end of the room, and they looked at each other, and that was it. And they were together for 37 years after that. Martin led a very full life, had to go through amputation of one leg and then the other leg. And he had a very squeaky voice, I guess because of his injury. And he'd say, I am now a short, tall man. No, yes, a short, tall man, because he'd lost both legs. Anyway, Martin gave me a piece of feedback once in one of these exercises where we exchange feedback. And I used to be nastier then. I used to be more defensive or whatever. And he gave me a piece of feedback that said, and the feedback went on. Each of us gave each other about 2 or 3 minute feedback. It was a big deal, you know. And you know, our support partner wrote it down and all that. And Martin just looked at me and said, Peter, you got too much going for shots. That's my feedback. And that was in the context of me getting into arguments with people in groups and getting very defensive. But that was feedback. You know, that was my self-identity, okay? Of being too defensive, too wordy in my defensiveness, somehow they're getting into unnecessary arguments with people.
Peter, are you aware that you disappeared and we can't hear you? And can you hear us?
I think he got a phone call. That's my guess.
Oh, okay.
I heard a phone ring. So Mary, are you on the line or who else on?
No, Mary's not here. Mary had a class.
Somebody else is on the line.
I'm here, Nikki.
Sorry.
Hi.
Okay, Nikki.
Oh,
okay.
good, he's back.
Sorry. Yeah, well, that's okay. And somehow or other that feedback really encapsulated, you know, why wasn't I more confident? Why wasn't I just more steady? You know, why did I get embroiled in these ways? And then sometimes, I'm embarrassed to say this, sometimes when I'd get embroiled in these situations, I'd start talking about how good I was, which was always, I cringe when I say that because it always sort of went wrong. So, you know, that piece of feedback, because I guess, you know, what Martin was saying, you know, when you get into disputes, you take cheap shots. And you don't need to do that. You can handle it a different way, and you've got enough going for yourself to find a different way to handle it. And you know that was sort of the road into stuff about Australia and being the smallest kid in the class and being teased at times for being, I guess, what could be called sort of intellectual amongst a whole group of kids that were sports crazy. You know, that's Australia. and leaving and not going back, although I had a very happy childhood. You know, so in that little bit of feedback, you know, why do you take so many cheap shots when you got a lot going for you? Was, yeah, it sort of leads into work. I've just seen it happen over and over and over again. And it's often the way, I'd say it's the way we communicate, that it's the part of our communication that turns people off. And that's where it's self-identity, because David's saying, you know, self-identity is the part of ourselves that other people can see that we don't know. So I guess dear Martin's feedback to me was, you don't know that you take cheap shots when you do not need to. And if, you know, you can take that concept in all parts of, you know, parents to kids, kids on the playground. Yes, a little boy who's a bully can at times look very pathetic. He thinks he looks tough. That's the persona gap, you know, the difference between the little boy's perception of himself and other people's perception of him. Even if he is feared by the children, he won't be perceived as inherently strong. He'll be, you know, perceived as a bully, which almost by definition is picking on people smaller than you, or who aren't as surrounded by as many friends or followers as you are, therefore you can pick on. So he comments, cease.
I'm just wondering how you turn that around, because I'm asking that for my own self. I don't know if somebody would say that to me, but I feel it to myself that that I get too defensive at times about certain things. And so I'm curious what how do I calm myself down and kind of see what you were just saying, that I don't need to react to this, or I don't, I don't, there's nothing good's going to come out of me reacting to it. Why even get involved in this, you know? So, but but I'll carry it around for a while and have, you know, little conversations going on in my mind, like, oh, that, and waste time on something that probably doesn't really need it. So I'm not sure if you're saying you found a way to stop doing that, or you have some ways, different ways. But I'd like to know what those are, or from other people too.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that, Nikki? I feel in some ways this is your area, more ways than one.
I don't really know why you feel like it's my area.
Oh.
Am I missing a point?
It's sort of the bit where you can get behind what's going on for somebody, okay? So I'll just take it off and take off on it, and then you might like to come in.
Yeah, okay.
I guess it's, you know, I'm not saying I easily came up with a answer, Cease, to the challenge, but I think it is I guess the simple thing is, why do I do that? Okay. And then if we get into why do I do that, then we get into our memory links. We can take it back somewhere.
I see what you mean now about, yeah.
Okay.
That's my,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you want
And
to
the
come
other-
in there?
Let me
Hmm?
just clarify real quick. The other thing is, why do I take the bait?
Yeah.
Nikki, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Okay, so interestingly about, why in the main am I different from that, which is because of my my memory links. It just happened that for me, my childhood tactic for self-protection was just to go in, and not connect with the world. So that, I mean, all my therapeutic work is about trying to do the, loosening that up and making that become possible. But therefore, it means I've still got that thing. So it means when there's a thing between me and another person, I fall back automatically on my early MO, right? So fortunately for me, that is that I get self-reflective. Now the danger is me going, taking, thinking it's not to blame, but taking it on too much, whatever the problem is. But when I work at it more, it's like the question that comes to me, what's my part in, it's like, okay, the person I'm feeling triggered, the person's triggering me. And then I automatically sort of go to, I guess it's, for me, it's just the familiar and therefore more comfortable place of what's that triggering in me, because that's where I feel safer, because that's the only place you've actually got any actual control over. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that, if you do the opposite thing, you haven't got control over yourself, and that's when one comes forward from a knee-jerk reaction, and then you're embroiled with the other person in their knee-jerk reactions, and then there's no resolution possible because everybody's a 5-year-old or something.
Yes.
So I'm a 5-year-old, but I'm like being silent and thinking like crazy. But it has ended up that it's ended up. I don't think that's a good start of a sentence. But where I am in recent years is like the odd person triggers me into what I've got left is the really, really dense, actual, deep originating, hard little nugget of the causal factor in me. And so like, I was working on that today again. That I'm just sort of determined to break myself free from. And it's a hard work, but just happened. For me, it's all condensed. I used to say that I had repetitive brain injury because most other people get a variety of shitty things go on in their development, and mine was just the same tedious repeat. So that's why I feel like it's so dense. What am I trying to say? So I'm trying to say that nowadays, to get at it, it's like, oh my God, it has to be so crazily specific, the little bit that gets triggered. And nowadays, just in really the last 2 or 3 years, I really now, so I've got somebody at the moment who triggered it a year and a half ago. And it's like, I can't afford to let that opportunity go, because it might be years again before somebody comes along who happens to be so specific on the real central nugget of thing that I need to break free of, or untangle. What am I trying to say? I don't know. Help me out, Peter. Link it to what I'm saying about me
I think the
to the
link
overall
is,
thing.
yeah, because the overall thing for you is you go deeply, deeply, deeply into where it came from, okay? And you have a need to do that. So that's more, that is more, okay. That's more your personal work, right?
Yeah, that's the specific thing that's unique to me, that I have to do that because of that thing that I just said. Sorry to interrupt. That mine was so repetitive, whereas most people have a bit of a random, this, that, and the other can get triggered. You get more variety of things you can explore, I think.
So there's something about linking it in here, which is not easy. But on the other hand, I think there's something about this discussion that's useful in the sense that it's harder not making much sense, because that's the struggle we need if we're going to get transparency right, and if we're going to get script lines right. We need to go through it not being sort of cut and dried. And there's something about the example I used about myself is almost a little bit too cut and dried. Because the bit I would say, there is a real mystery about when transparency works. Cynthia.
Well, I'm just looking at this, and I'm looking at some of this as in terms of the theoretical things as an astrologer, and what you're talking about now makes a lot of sense from that, because you have what other see your first part, I mean, this is mapped out. This is your first house. It's who you are. It's also your body, and it can be considered your identity, but it's much more surface. But right beneath it is the 12th house, which is the secrets that you don't even know. And there's sort of like there's three houses that involve secrets, and they're all different. The 4th house is the private stuff, your home, your background, where you came from, who you are, your roots. The 8th house is kind of the underground stuff, and the stuff that you know, but you definitely want to keep secret. It usually has to do with things that, can be underground. It can be things that you're embarrassed by. And then there's the 12th house, which is the secrets you don't even know. But it's interesting when you were talking about how other people can see that. And I'm just looking at that as yes, because it's very much right next to your first house, which is how you're coming across in the world. So even though you don't know it, the world can see. And actually, it's very connected to your public persona, which is a different house. Sorry to go into jargon,
okay.
but it's helping me because that's a language I already know, that I can kind of map this language onto, that helps me understand things a little better. But I think on a more personal level, I had two thoughts. One of the things that I've noticed doing the videos and putting them up. And so sometimes I get to my own stuff and it's like, oh my gosh, how much do I interrupt myself? Instead of, it's like, well, no wonder nobody understands what I'm saying. You can't follow it because I keep interrupting. And plus getting used to not cringing at my own voice and face. That's but I've heard other people say they do too, so I don't feel too bad about that.
Good, you mustn't.
But and then there was a third thing that, in terms of another part of feedback I get from other people when I'm people tend to see me as much stronger and more confident than I really am inside. And people are like, well, and it's I mean, and I see where it comes from. I mean, it was a survival strategy for many different reasons, and it's also cultural. You just, that's not showing your emotions is not something you do. We're talking about script. Our whole, family dinners were scripted. You talk. I could go through. And so everybody behaved themselves. It worked well. So I didn't have, even though we had a lot of dysfunction, there was never really any drama over the holidays, or at least not in public with the family, because you came in, you had some glug. I'm thinking about Christmas. You talked about the weather. You talked about maybe your job. You had a 20-minute discussion about where everybody was going to sit, even though you all sat in the same place. When you're eating, the uncles told bad jokes. And then everybody went and watched TV until it was time. I mean, it was just this very scripted way of doing things, and everybody behaved themselves, and that's what I'm used to. And I went to my spouse's, the first time I went to her big Italian family for Christmas dinner, I was almost in shock because, the uncles were screaming at each other over stocks. Children were flying all over the place. and then after the uncles were having the shouting match, they came upstairs and everybody was friends. And I'm like, oh my goodness, if somebody in my family had a shouting match over it during Christmas dinner, that would be bad enough that people wouldn't talk to each other for 20 years, which actually happened to my grandmother's brother, who didn't talk to anybody for 20 years and then did. So, and nobody knows why he stopped, and nobody knows why he started. So it just is. But sorry, that's a bit of an aside. But so those are kind of the thoughts that I had about that.
Yeah, I think it's relevant because some of a lot of self-identity is, or some of self-identity really is culturally determined. And you just said it, the difference between Italian families and other families, even the difference between Southern Italian families and Northern Italian families. The South talks about the rational Milanese, okay, which is essentially saying they don't know how to live life because they're so uptight. What am I saying? So, yeah, there is stuff about whatever cultural heritage we carry affects some of our self-identity, and it's a way almost to see self-identity because we often can't see how the rest of the world sees our country, okay? Often and that can create war, can create huge misunderstanding. How does the rest of the world see the United States? How does the rest of the world see China? How does the rest of the world see England? It's not the way that those three countries see themselves. So it's got some, as I feel about so much of his work, You know, it's got these surprising applications. And I think it can pick at almost the difficulty, because the examples that are going through my head, you know, the rest of the world can see America as loud and dominant and try and dominate the whole goddamn world because America's so big and wealthy. And on the inside, America's saying, where are we going? Help. Yeah, the rest of the world can see America as, I'm trying to find a description, almost arrogantly and complacently wealthy. Okay. And inside America, Americans see themselves quite different than that. Australians can, I know, seem very sort of loud and assertive. I'll use that word, assertive. And can use it well to, you know, carve careers in other countries. Yeah, inside we're full of insecurities. So, you know, they're broad brushstrokes, and someone could come along and accurately say, I don't know what I'm talking about. But, you know, the broad brushstrokes are useful, I think, in terms of learning the material. And then if we bring that back to transparency, script lines, and straight messages, for Australians to say, you know, look, history is quite short compared to other places, compared to Spain or Russia or China. You know, our history is quite short, and we struggle with some of that. We struggle to know who we are. You know, they totally never struggle to know who they are. They know who they are. They've been around for 2,500 years. So, you know, if Australians could come up with a script line and a bit of transparency around that, and then a straight message, which would be, you know, we've taken on a lot, and there's some of the strengths we have, some of the abilities to be confident and to be innovative that we really believe in. I mean, that almost, but it tends to come across as insecurities often does, with a funny sort of defensiveness. And I'm not trying to be clever, but I came up with that example. And then there's the feedback Martin Foster gave to me. And, you know, there's some sort of connection between those. Cynthia.
I don't know if this is directly related, but it might be when you're talking about direct messages and stuff. One of the, in learning Japanese, and sorry, it's a little hard to talk about it because the person who taught this, who was my main tutor, is the one who just passed away.
Yeah.
But she would talk, and actually it was actually quite brilliant, I think, how she would describe it is that you know, one of the things is that there were things I could say in Japanese, and I'm actually, in some ways, even though my Japanese is not that great, there's some ways I can communicate better in Japanese than I can in English. And part of that, I think, is that you can, because I remember I was explaining to somebody who was, and it was somebody else, and he was like, well, you can, if you can't say something in English, it's not English's fault. It's I'm like, okay, but but anyway,
say that bit again. I didn't quite catch that.
It's like English has got all these words. I'm just adding more to
All
it.
right. Okay.
And if you can't say it in English, it's not English's fault. it's
right.
Like,
right.
yeah. But how she described it, which was, like I said, which was brilliant, is that languages, it's about agility. There are things you can pretty much find a way to say anything you want in any language, but the difference is whether it's agile or not, whether or not you have to go through a whole lot of rigmarole to say something, or whether you can say something easily. And some things are just because it's said more often, and I think this is how language influences your speaking, your thinking almost. Like one of the things, and I'm thinking about this in English, because I think that English, well, actually two things. English is probably, compared to Japanese in particular, it always sounds more confident. And in part because English forces you a lot of times, if you're going to speak clearly and directly, it forces you to say things you really have no way of knowing. For example, you have to, in English, if you're going to connect two clauses, you have to say the connection and, if, but, or, where in Japanese and some other language, you can just put them together. You don't have to specify how they're actually related. And it's really nice because you don't necessarily know. And there's another one in terms of equality, which is interesting, that I found on my own, that actually in Asia, one of the reasons they do prefer to have English as a diplomatic language, and the reason is a very interesting one, because all Asian language, including Japanese, you cannot open your mouth in Japanese without making a statement of your relationship with the other person. It depends. You conjugate verbs, or not conjugate, you use verb forms differently depending on who you're speaking to. You'll use a certain verb form if you're talking to a friend or somebody you're close to, and somebody informal, or to like your child, or you use a different verb form if you're talking to people you don't know well, or to a superior, or you use a completely different one to somebody. There's three main ones, and then
Wow.
businesses. Yeah, and that's for every verb. You have to, in every sentence, you have to declare your relationship to the other person. And Japanese and all the Asian languages do that, but English doesn't. And in fact, English, a lot of the even stuff that's retained, like the formal and informal use, is not in English anymore. Hasn't been for a couple hundred years. So if you're in a diplomatic situation, you don't necessarily want to declare your relationship to the other person. Like, for example, if you're talking to another country, you don't want to say like either equality or superior, because then you're going to sound rude and obnoxious. But you also don't want to sound too humble, because then you might put yourself in a subordinate position. So if you use English, you can just avoid that whole subject whatsoever. But that agility it's just and like I said, I'm not sure how that's related to all of this, but but it's something you can't. It's something that I would never have noticed if I hadn't learned learned another language. And actually, I am learning a couple other languages too. We just, and like one thing, I think I've brought this example here before, but there was, I talked about persona gap. I guess a friend of a mutual friend, but she was closer to the friend who passed, was working as a translator in Japan. And this academic person, was having his work translated into Japanese, and in Japanese, he put a lot of things like, desho, dororoka, no kamoshire, my son, where a lot of those words are sort of softening words. They're sort of, well, I maybe, might be, it should be. I mean, because in Japanese, sounding too sure makes you sound arrogant and rude. And even things, like I feel this way, I think, you don't, you pepper a lot with I think, because you don't want to sound like you're being too confident. And the academic was furious. He's like, what are you doing? Why? I don't think I know this. And the translator said, you can't say that. You're going to sound so arrogant and rude and nobody's going to want to read it. So anyways, I think I'm finished now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, that's the persona gap between countries, that's for sure. And I'm sorry.
I have to go. I have a visiting nurse coming, so I'll see you all next time. Nothing, no problem.
Okay.
They just do a regular checkup every 6 months or something like that. Okay.
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 Well, good luck. Good luck
Thanks.
with the checkup.
It'll be fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I'll just be back in a minute, everybody.
Okay. Yeah, I think taking this material into countries, yeah, because how a country sees itself and how other people see it is a pretty big deal. And how a country sees itself is a big deal.
I was talking to a while back, a pastor who is a Canadian. This is when my spouse was still a pastor, and one of the things that she talked, and she came into the U.S. She's like, what, at least from her perception, America looked completely militaristic, because of the obsession with guns and with,
No, absolutely. And one of the things I say with some pride, Canada is perhaps the sanest country in the world. My children who live in Canada, are just critical of it, okay? They live in Ottawa and British Columbia. So that's a very big that is being in touch with different parts of the country. That's what I'm trying to say. Really being in touch with different parts of the country. And yeah, they can be sort of very critical, but underneath that, there is an optimism. There is a, my God, we're lucky to live here, okay? And don't we have so much going for us? But at the same time, a bit like Australia, that's rather assertive, okay? It would almost be better if it wasn't spoken. But southern Italy and Sicily, and other people, I heard the expression recently. Someone from Spain actually said, who was in England, well, there's nothing for us there. Okay, coming from a small town in Spain. That's why they're in England. There's nothing for us there. It's a very it's a very strong statement. I can't imagine a Canadian saying there's nothing for me here. Except if First Nation Canadians living on reservations might well say there's nothing for me here. So I think, yeah, I think the tools are useful across a whole bunch of different areas. And I think the combination of straight messages and transparency can be pretty powerful, you know. And some people know how to do that. Some people have a talent to do that, but some people don't.
I was thinking in terms of this is a little back to what you were saying about other people's perception and your own. Country-wise, I've been watching one of the great courses I've been watching, I'm very slowly, is the history of India. And one of the nice things that this professor is doing, which is something I've never really, well, seen a lot of people do, talk about history, edict and he had two words for it, edict and edict. I don't know, I don't remember the words, but the idea was is that looking at the history from the inside, from the stories that are told within the country to the story in terms of both the religion and the stories, and because that's much more tied than it is in a lot of Western countries now. The religion and their history and that, and the other perspective, how an outsider, the outside stories, and sometimes it's even, you know, in terms of, because India has such an old culture and it had such, I mean, it's not just our Western eyes from the future, but also India was connected with a lot of other cultures, like what, you know, what the nearby culture story was about it, as well as what this story was in India about it, which is, and, you know, and he said when he does this perspective, he doesn't say one's more important than the other, but it's good to look at when you're getting the full picture, both. Yeah, it's really interesting. That's, but anyways.
Yeah, sort of taking that, you know, because there's a whole genre of literature that is Indian writers writing in English. And, well, Shaman Rushdie is, you know, one well-known example. So looking at India from the outside, because they went and lived, they emigrated out of England to, out of India, sorry, to England or the States. But in terms of the novel, it's mainly to England, and then writing about India from that other place, you know, from a place of observing it from the outside. Which I think is another way, because I guess what straight, well, all three of them are, you know, transparency, script lines, straight messages. At their best, they're coming from a deep knowledge of ourselves. And that deep knowledge from many of us, and those of us in our field, and those of us who are mainly in the caring life force, sorry, I'm a bit slow. yeah, what it comes from is a deep knowledge of ourselves. And if you take, I mean, you can take this to extremes, and in terms of looking at nations, and sometimes that deep knowledge of ourselves might have to be very painful, and then we can communicate from that. Because as a student of history, I'm quite amazed about how Germany went through everything Germany went through, and then came out of it as a country that provides stability and peace to the world. A country that provides stability, peace, and generosity to the world. Come on. Coming out of Germany, 1945 is not that far away, but that's happened. That's happened. Or, people in America coming out of slavery and becoming arrogant, self-assured politicians. How do people find those transformations? So that bring it back to the practicality in my statement. The truth is, the truth is difficult. Secrets are a burden. If we can find a way to get the stuff out, so instead of keeping it all inside, and it happened in South Africa. They really tried with what's called peace and reconciliation commissions. That was the white and the black people.
It was truth and reconciliation, wasn't it?
It was. Thank
and...
you. Yeah, no, thank you, Nikki. You're right. Truth and reconciliation. And it was, I just got that wrong. Thank you. And that was coming from, we have to face the truth. And I guess truth and reconciliation, somehow do we have to face the truth together? Yeah, and I think you could say that a large part of America not being able to face the truth of slavery. Slavery was a fact. And not being able to face that is, leading to disaster.
And I think in the United States, I do think it needs to be, I think a lot of, I don't know how to put it. When I was, this was 20 years ago when I was involved with MCC, Metropolitan Community Church. It was a church in the gay and lesbian community, Christian. I mean, I'm not even Christian anymore, but at the time I was. And one of the things but it was done with a lot of, with the liberation theology and stuff. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I don't necessarily agree with a lot of this anymore, at least not. I've changed. Anyways, but I'm going to go back to where it was. I mean, I don't necessarily renounce it on a practical level, but I think that there's more. But anyways, before I get in, let me just go back to what the point. But one of the things that I do think is true, it is an issue that's in American politics is that, let me say, as you know, everybody's racist. And I would say, I wouldn't say that. I would say in the United States, yes, I would say that's true. And if you think about, say, if you have, now it's like, oh, you're racist, you got to stop this. And I don't think that helps the matters. I mean, I think that what needs to happen is we all are race is an underlying feature in everything in the United States. It might be in other countries too, I don't know, but and whether we know it or not. And it's really hard to and learning to confront your inner. And it's not just all white people. I mean, there's still this sense that even, and this is where we would talk about oppression sickness, and we talk this in the gay community too. There is a feel where you take on the views of your oppressors. And it happens with women too, women and men. For example, with women and men, women will automatically assume that the man's what a man is doing is more important than them. My grandmother, oh, he's busy, so she'll ask the women who are just as busy, but the men are busy, and there's this sort of feel, and it's sometimes even worse among that. Like in the example in the churches, people would be on time for their family obligations, but they'd come late to church. And they would think that their church commitments with their old church, because most people were from an old church, and because of their pain, they came to us. But they still treat straight things as more important, straight people as more. I mean, it just how you treated, and not just it just interferes. And I'm bringing that to the people who are oppressed, but it's everybody. I mean, there's this sense that, and I just learned one of the things, I can only watch so much of it. Well, they're great course, because it just was too much for me to handle. I have to take it very slowly. But racism was, and I didn't realize this, it wasn't some unconscious thing that happened. It was deliberately placed into American culture during the colonial periods by the rich landholders. They deliberately created and it was what they would do with the poor white peoples, because who before were in solidarity with the slaves and the freed slaves and that, but they would purposely give them positions of power, positions where they had a little bit of power over the people, and it just fostered this, and it was done for very cynical reasons, because if they could divide and conquer the poor white people and the slaves, the rich people the rich landholders could maintain their power. I mean, it was cynical. It was talked about. It was discussed. And that whole thing just blew my mind, because there was actually Black people who owned slaves in the colonial period. Not many, but there was one or two who would buy their freedom. But I don't know. It's just that this is it. It's so ingrained, and it's so much a part of everything, that even if you're consciously trying to do the right thing, there's all these unconscious things that are gonna be part of your thinking and who you are. And
well, that's where I think because I guess one aim of transparency is to be able to have a dialogue, to be able to have a discussion. And where it came from with me was, and I was really, I wasn't very experienced at all. I was very inexperienced, really, initially. But it came from wanting to have a different sort of discussion. This is who I am, this is who you are. You're serving time in this prison, and I'm going home at 5 o'clock. It literally sort of started there. And sort of right away, I had some real criticism, Can't remember how I overcame it, because I was just doing it wrong. Should be all about him, and it shouldn't be anything about me. So I guess transparency is, this is who I am, right? And then straight messages, script lines, it being clear about this is who I am. And learning how to be clear about this is who I am. So many people, including myself, you're home. I'm not saying this to everybody, but you're home, and when you're home, you're really critical of things, okay? You're critical of your country and its government or whatever. And then you go the other side of the world, and people are criticizing your country, and all of a sudden you become defensive about it. And I think I'd almost say that's because we don't have the right script lines. And I imagine there's some people who just naturally have a sense of script lines and have a sense of nourishing transparency. And they can say it, right? They'll find a way to say it. I don't know. So what I'm saying here is, I want to use those as examples to look at. Okay, truth is difficult, but even when you want to be truthful, use that phrase. It can be hard to get it right. Okay. And then there's something about how that relates to passive listening. Sort of being able to let in when we're wrong. Because I was just doing some writing today on, the current writing I'm doing, which is called Coming Through. How do we come through hard times, and in coming through hard times, transform ourselves. And the reason I'm sharing that bit here, I'm using, and then I got into passive listening, how important passive listening is. And then I got into, and the reason I want to bring it up, you'll see it, I got into two examples, okay? One was war and the other one was divorce, okay? And in both situations, passive listening can be transformative. That's my claim. And, I'm spelling it out in different ways, but just in the bit, literally I was writing today, just that bit was about not being able to passive listen to, we have to retreat because they're much more powerful than we are. We're outnumbered, we've got to retreat. That's it, being able to passive listen to that in war, which was rather than reacting. And then the example I used about divorce, if you change your locks, you'll be in trouble with the judge. If you change the locks, you'll be in trouble with the judge. That's not a good thing to do. I just use those examples of passive listening that was hard to do, right? Someone being sort of, just that. And linking that in, I guess if we can passive listen at different times, then we can find the transparency. I think we'll find the transparency and we'll find the straight messages, because we'll be coming from what we really feel and believe. But that can be, I'm scared of losing the war or the divorce, either one. The transparency needs to be, I'm in the fight, but I'm scared of losing.
See, that one of the things that when I was a divorce lawyer, well, two things. One, you know, the whole competitiveness and the whole, I mean, that's how the American legal system is. I don't know how others work, because it's an adversarial system, which I think does not work real well when it comes to family law.
Yeah.
I think it's awful. I mean, and a lot of divorce, I mean, there's been a lot of movements to change things. But there was, I think I may have shared this at one point, but there was a story I heard from from one of my mentors, and he was my boss for when I worked at the law firm. And it was this couple, they were involved in a divorce. They got divorced. They had post-decree litigation about the children, and they were going on for 10, 15 years with this. I mean, it was a nightmare.
Ouch.
Yeah. And but then they went to, I guess they were she was a very good mediator. I don't know who it was, but they went to mediation with this mediator. And afterwards, actually, I think they ended up marrying again. I'm not sure if they did or not, but when they were done, they said, you know, if we had listened to each other the way we listened to each other during mediation, we would, our marriage would have stayed together. You know, that, and there's a lot of that. And I think there's a lot of, and I tried, particularly with issues with children. I mean, with property, it's talking about persona gap, and most attorneys knew this, and they would say this, you know, whenever people get into a personal property battle, things like the salt and pepper shakers, the you know, the sofa, and get into those, it's never about that. You know, it's never really about the salt and pepper shakers. You know, that's just
yeah.
And I mean, this was something we all knew, but you had to sort of go along with it and do it, because people had to deal with their anger and upset and whatever. But another story I had about this, and I told this to a friend who had gone through a divorce, wasn't a client of mine. She said, you know what? Yeah, I learned my lesson the hard way about that. I fought tooth and nail over every piece of property. And then a couple years later, he had all new stuff and I had all the junk. You know?
Okay. All right.
But, you know, and they did this also about, I guess, the clarity. I went to a seminar. This was before I left. I mean, I was kind of having a rough time, but I was thinking maybe going in a different area of law, which was into probate. So I went like a day-long probate seminar. And oh my goodness, and they talk about direct messages. They were just talking about being really clear when you're writing the wills and stuff, because, you know, in fact a case where there was like 10 years of litigation because somebody may have actually forgotten to put a comma in. And I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want that kind of responsibility, because it changed the meaning of it enough that there was a dispute, and they had to figure out what the intent was of there. But, you know, like one of the things that you know, she would say things like, is like, have one person as the executor of the will, and people will always want to make the firstborn, but that's you want the person who can handle this. You know, talking about, like, you know, my older sister runs a wine shop, and I'm a probate attorney. Who should she have being the executor? You know, and people say, oh, the person who runs the wine shop. You know, but you know, there's this sort of sense, and they said that never have two siblings be the executors together, particularly if they don't get along, because, you know, sometimes they had one mom made them co-executors, hoping that would bring them together, which it didn't. You know, but there's, you know, but there's a certain amount of, I don't know how to say, but a more cynical one about how this is the last time they're going to have, you know, an authority judge a dispute between siblings. Will have an authority figure judge a dispute between them, you know, because the parents are gone. So now you got the judge in the place. But
okay, and that's a statement that's often made, is it?
Well, that was a statement that the I don't know, often made, but the instructor of this whole course. And I'm like, I that's when I decided then, it's like, you know what, I can't I'm like, no, I can't handle probate. I can handle,
Okay.
I can handle, you know, oh, that mean my ex-husband was I can handle that. I can't handle, you know, the whole mommy loved you better than me and, you know, all that stuff that goes in probate. But I'm sorry, I got myself on a tangent from which I don't think I'll return. Sorry about that. But
That's all
yeah,
right.
it's but yeah, that whole but I guess what I was trying to make the point was, you know, this whole manipulating thing that, you know, I just don't do it, you know, be very clear about that it's very important because yeah, you have the dead hand controlling things from the grave. You know, it's very, very important that I guess what you can do things in your will to make or not have a will to make life easier for everybody or to make life harder for everybody, you know. And
That's interesting because that sort of, that is an example of script of straight messages, isn't it?
mhm.
Because I guess, yeah, a straight message is trying not to be pulled into the mixed message. You know, okay, the dispute is about the salt and pepper shaker, okay? Or the dispute is about the property on the lake, you know, who knows? Or the dispute is about the kids. So I guess a straight message would, in that situation, be really useful and really necessary. And the example you gave, I think, was a good one, because somehow or other, it was the listening side more than the speaking side, but the mediator got the people to deliver straight messages. That's my guess. And because I guess in a divorce, if you can say the very hard things, but say them in a way that, or in a marriage, if you can say the very hard things, but if you can say them in a way that has some nourishment in it, some sense of appreciation, then you're giving yourself a chance to move ahead. But if the transparency can't be, you know, I'm dead scared of being on my own, or some real clear, simple, honest statement, and people get pulled into pride, into the performance life force, the material life force, and can't say those things. And yet, when you think of it, someone going through a divorce, just saying, one thing that's going on for me, I'm just dead scared of being on my own. You know, to say it could feel like a huge act of cowardice or denying your own strength or something. But when you look at it, it's not that big a deal, is it? Really? Someone saying, I'm scared of being on my own.
It was right, and the change. I mean, even if they're not being on their own, actually, my mentor talked about, who had been through a divorce before, you know, and he talked about it, and he says, you know, being divorced is a huge change, and you know,
Yeah.
you have to change your bank account. You have to, you know, for women, you might go back to your maiden name. You know, there's just this whole, and it's, even if the divorces that always went well, I mean, in terms of I mean, divorces where it
Yeah.
was not, you know, there wasn't a lot of fighting, there wasn't a lot of headache. We usually got through it pretty fast. I mean, it had nothing to do with how complicated the property issues were. It had to do with how love can quickly turn to hate.
Yeah.
When people just follow, it was the ones that were the easy ones were the ones where people just grew apart. They were just too different. They realized they had made a mistake. They weren't really compatible and they thought they were, those kind of things, those usually just fell apart. And a lot of times people could even stay friends and they can even co-parent. They just realize, okay, we're just too different. We shouldn't have gotten married. We made a mistake. We're probably in Pellin terms, we married on a high and now in the calm, it's just not right. Whereas if the people who hurt each other, and people do hurt each other a lot, those are the divorces that were ugly, and a lot of times they didn't address the hurt. There were times I would try. You can do it so much. You'd say, well, maybe you should talk about this with and I sometimes particularly people were worried about money, and I was worried about. I've got a lot of material life force, so and I didn't want to have people paying me. I'm like, you know what, you'd be really better off rather than fighting here, paying money to a therapist right now. Get your therapy out of the way, and then we'll get to the divorce part. Because they work out these issues in the salt and pepper shakers, in the in the children, and it's devastating for children. That there's and it's because even 30 and 40 year olds are upset when their parents divorce.
Wow.
And it's there's just some, but yeah, that whole, and usually those messy divorces, it's usually because somebody hurt somebody else. And they never talked with it. They never addressed it. They never discussed it with each other. And that hurt built up for years, sometimes decades, and turned. And that's when things got messy. And sometimes stories like, when our child died, he went off and left me alone. Just there's things like that, and those kind of things can. And so sorry, I'm going into, and I guess I'm contradicting myself, because last time I was all skeptical about this, but
no, it's useful for me because I do use divorce in my examples in my writing, and the bit you add to what I know, it really helps. Okay. We got to stop there. And we'll do our usual way of stopping. I'm in King's Lynn, where it is dark and I think cold. Nikki.
I'm in Wimbledon, and it'll be the same time, and it's dark and cold. And just wanted to say thank you for all that, Cynthia. That was all really interesting to me.
Yeah, me too. Cynthia.
Cynthia Kankakee, I guess that's the persona gap, because I'm thinking, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I just talked and talked and talked.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, yeah.
That's why we let you talk, because it was interesting.
Yeah. Okay. See you Sunday.
See you Sunday.
And thanks for coming.
Okay.
All
right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. 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 Bye.